known, and there's always pushback, especially in the southern states, isn't it? At any rate, most organizations try to keep good records over time, seldom do. Voluntary organizations have the worst of it, the most difficult time. At any rate, thus record keeping of names and places and dates, it becomes sketchy also over time. Memories by elders start fading, becoming more vague with each telling. Thus it is with the story of this church. In our story, what we're trying to do here is to create, instead of history, we're trying to create our story so that it includes both her story and his. Younger members usually view history as dead, dry, and gone, and usually induces sleep. We older folks begin to see our stories as continuing sagas, blending now's events with the past, stretching back in time, continuously alive, actually, within the living evidence that we see before our eyes. Looking at the buildings we meet in, the rituals that we perform with very little thought of their continuing presence, the attitudes and beliefs that are soul deep within us, and we tend not to, we just take for granted. Thus, our story is alive within each of us, whether known or not, whether felt or not. You don't believe me? When you go home, look in the mirror and see how far back and how complicated your image is with your family and your past. Thus it is with UUCT. This presentation is about looking into now's mirror, seeing our church as a continuous collection of beings stretching back and forward in time as one continuous gathering of folks busy living our collective experiences. Well, before we get started with the church, let's talk about Tampa Bay in general a bit. Unitarianism and Universalism have been around Tampa Bay for over a century. The Unitarian Church of St. Petersburg was founded in 1915. They're in their original building. It was organized as the first Universalist Society of St. Petersburg, and it shared ministers with the Universalist Church of the Good Shepherd in Tarpon Springs. St. Petersburg's current building was built in 1929. One of UUCT's earliest members, Miss Betty McClure Lee, was a member of the St. Petersburg Church and going there, driving across the bay, until she saw an ad in the Tampa Tribune in 1955 that a new fellowship had been started here. And so she looked it up, and she started in 1955 and came until she got too sick that her brother from Orlando came and took her to Orlando and put her in an assisted living. But at any rate, we have the Betty McClure Lee Award presented each year to members of the church who've done an extended volunteering over a long period of time. The Tarpon Springs Church was founded in 1898. It's the oldest of either Unitarian or Universalist churches in the whole state of Florida. It's also famous nationally and internationally for its series of George Ennis Jr. Paintings. Make sure, if you haven't been, to go to both the Tarpon Springs and the St. Petersburg churches. They've got, it's a journey well spent. And we did that during COVID, I think, yeah. Okay, there is evidence of a 1920s Unitarian church in Tampa from newspaper articles from that period. It's also recorded in early records of the American Unitarian Association. The fledgling church here ceased to exist after about a decade. It had a fairly large African American presence to begin with. Tampa, however, never attracted liberal religious northern followers who moved south. They all migrated toward Pinellas County and the Gulf Beaches area. I wonder why. It wouldn't be for another quarter century that Tampa would spawn a liberal congregation. UUCT is the product of that 1950s attempt. Okay, now we get to the church. We're going to show 3 color photos of the first 3 of the 4 buildings. This is at the west entrance of Ybor City, you know where the big arch is over 7th Avenue? Right there is the Martí Mateo Afro-Cuban Club. Well, they're building now a 4-story apartment and shopping center, and there's a path between the Mateo Club and the new building about that big, so it'll disappear. At any rate, there is a photo of Betty Lee, one of the various earliest members of the church. And I was fortunate enough to haul her around town for a day, and we went to the various sites. The next photo is of the Friday morning musicale and Tampa Federated Women's Club. It's down in Hyde Park, and that's where the congregation met later. And you see the windows in the front there. That's where the congregation had their RE programs. I'll get more about that later. And the third photo, which is also in the front of our program, well, a different one. There's Betty and I looking at the church down in South Tampa. Thanks. A great book society, book club, met in that Martí Mateo Afro-Cuban Club sometime in the very early 1950s. One source said 1952. The official founding date for the Unitarian Association was 1955. The group seemed to have started with a small group of college professionals and other intellectuals. And as the group grew, there grew a desire to become more than just a discussion group, a book discussion group. Apparently, there were those within the Great Book Society who wanted to do more than just discuss Western classical civilization. The group chose to pursue developing a Unitarian fellowship. During this period, a professor from Tampa U, Chuck Varney, and his Japanese-American wife, Yosh, they were members, and they were the lay leaders of this developing fellowship. Professor Varney was with the church from its founding in 52 or 3 up through 57. And he got a job at the University of Florida, and they moved to Gainesville. The Afro-Cuban Club members, many of them were Hispanic or Afro-Cuban. And they were a little undecided when the group decided to go to the Tampa Federated Women's Club, but they went anyway. And now we have some photos of the congregation meeting in the church. Right outside the window there is where Betty and I were standing. And this, we don't know that the dates are correct. This says 1952, and in the very next photo shows 1956, so I don't know. You can see that there's some Hispanic folks there. Whoops, I got away from the microphone, sorry. At any rate, during this time at the club, let's see, then the church, when they found out, the group, the Federated Women's Club, found out that the congregation, the fellowship was multicultural, multiracial, and they were asked to leave. And so I guess that's when the Unitarians began making I guess a little bit of a stir in and around Tampa. Now there's another photo of the Reverend Hardiman. He was the pastor, the part-time minister, when they moved to the new building there in South Tampa. Let's see. After the Women's Club asked them to leave, the Women's Club, the fellowship rented from an old Tampa Electric Company building downtown. And they met there for about a year. And then Tampa Electric told them they had to move out, and they tore the building down. And from what I understand, the present Tampa Electric building downtown is where that building was. And they built that at that time. At any rate, in 1960, the fledgling fellowship purchased the former St. Mary's Episcopal Church on Concordia Street in Palmacia, which is in the Inner Bay and South Tampa area. The building is still there. During the church's time there in South Tampa, they were there from 1960 through 72. Several ministers were called to lead the congregation. It was known as the Unitarian Fellowship of Tampa. Reverend Thomas Patrick Hardiman, a former Church of Christ ordained minister, was hired from 1959 through 61. Reverend Hardiman was our part-time minister during that time and was working toward being fellowshipped with the Unitarian Ministers Association. In 1960, he applied and was denied. So the congregation had a vote in 1961. 2/3 of the congregation said they didn't want to hire him, and so he resigned. In 1963, the fellowship hired another minister, Reverend Richard Woodman. And I believe we've got a photo of the guy, and you can tell from his hair it was the 1960s, the flat top. And he came, and he was an actual ordained minister, but the church couldn't afford full-time employment. During his tenure, the congregation became very socially active. He and several members of the congregation actually participated in Martin Luther King's Selma, Alabama voting rights march. Reverend Woodman also served on 6 or 7 civil rights and social action boards and groups within Tampa during his stay. In the late 1960s, Reverend Woodman was forced to resign after supporting a homosexual service member at MacDill Air Force Base. He was being labeled as a communist by the then Tampa Tribune newspaper, and conservative groups in the community became so vocal that he resigned in 1969. In 1971, we hired a new minister. The church hired a new minister, Reverend Adrian Malott. And doesn't he look like a professor? He was a graduate of Starr King, and I found that out from Alex. Yeah, I found that out from Alex just a couple of months ago. She's been helping me correct some of the material here. At any rate, he was hired, and while he was earning his PhD in physics at USF, Reverend Malott led the church until 1978, and during his time as minister, the church purchased property in northeast Tampa in 1973. The original address was on Davis Road, but it later became 11400 Morse Road, which it is now. Reverend Malott was instrumental in facilitating the church's move, emphasizing that most of Tampa's growth was in a northerly direction. About 2/3 of the congregation moved north. 1/3 remained in South Tampa. The group that remained in South Tampa changed their name to All Souls Fellowship of Tampa, and they lasted only a few years, meeting in members' homes. The church building itself was sold to the Metropolitan Community Church, MCC, and they now have a thriving church there on Central Avenue between Hillsborough Avenue and MLK, near Hillsborough High School. I happen to know because I taught there for 30 years. The North Tampa Church initially held services in the Tyrone School building. They were portable buildings just right out here off the Memorial Garden. And you know this supply shed right there? Young people met there for a while. It wasn't a supply shed all the time. Anyway, it was an RE building. In 1974, the congregation purchased a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. If you don't know about them, Google that guy. It's really something. The kit came from California, and they had to figure out how to assemble it. So we've got, let's see, I had 2 photos, and I didn't know how to send them to Karen, so you'll have to go out and look at the old building. At any rate, notice that when you look at the small dome, look how rough the outer surface is. The congregation had the kids and different people throw concrete on it, and then they tried to smooth it with a trowel. During construction and good weather, services were held in the unfinished structure, so life was fairly rustic. We had another church in Citrus Park that met out under a shed for many years. I wonder if there's still a meeting congregation. They are? From 1978 through 1980, the Unitarian Fellowship of Tampa was lay-led. In 1980, the fellowship was incorporated then as the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tampa. Also in 1980, the Florida Department of Transportation began construction of I-75 right along the church's eastern edge. The DOT offered the congregation $7,000 for 1/3 acre. The congregation resisted. The church's intention from the beginning, and Alex helped me with this one, I didn't know this, from the beginning was to sell some land to the Department of Transportation, DOT, in order to help pay the church's mortgage off. Pretty cool. So UUCT filed a lawsuit contesting the DOT's condemnation of the land. Shortly before the case was scheduled to go to court, the DOT settled and paid the church over $70,000, but they reduced the property from 5 acres down to 2.5. but that was pretty good. That was good for this very small congregation. With DOT money in the bank, the church decided to call a new minister, using the account to cover any shortfall until membership could increase and pledges raise the financial base of the church. Once again, Alex. An aside to this, it's been written that Reverend Malott was mentioned in Time magazine as performing the first gay wedding in the United States. I also heard from interviewing people way back that another source mentioned that Reverend Mike Young was the one. So if anyone out here would like to start some research, the church needs to know. In 1980, Reverend Mike Young was called as the very first full-time minister, and here's his photo. He served for 13 years, and these were growing years. And the church, when I joined in 88 or 89, was around 120 members. And for a UU church, that's a pretty good size. Reverend Young was deeply involved in the Tampa Bay area human rights activities. The Tampa Human Rights Council was especially dear to him. Many church members, past and present, have been and are members of that council. How many of you have been to those breakfasts, the Tampa Human Rights Council breakfasts? Yeah. Are they still having them? Now that COVID's over, maybe things are getting back together again. Yeah. Reverend Young was also part of the group of Tampa ministers in 1988, mostly African American ministers and churches, who helped Reverend Sharon Streeter found the Hillsborough Organization of Progress and Equality, as Pat mentioned at the beginning of the service. We call it HOPE. UUCT is still one of the largest donors and participants. Is that right? Still one of the largest donors. Okay. Raise your hand if you're a part of HOPE or have been. Okay, more and more. The rest of you, you know what your assignment is. Okay. Reverend Young's wife, Nancy, was a notable artist and sculptor in Tampa. She won the Tampa Arts Council prize of $10,000 to create a bronze sculpture of two young boys. And those young boys happen to come from this church. One of them is Diana and my son, Ryan, and the other was Joey Nazian, the RE director at the time. And the original statue that she submitted, a little model was about that big, was the two boys back to back with their arms interlocked and a soccer ball in front of them. Well, Mayor, what was it, Iorio? Yeah. She decided she wanted them side by side. And so they had their arms around each other with the ball, in the front. At any rate, it was, the statue was there at Curtis Hickson Park in front of the Tampa Arts Museum for about a decade. And it's now located in a soccer park in New Tampa. I was going to ask Diana if we could bring the clay model in today, but if that thing cracked or broke, I'd be on the street. At any rate, a story about Nancy and Mike and I, we loaded up the life-size clay image and put it in the back of a pickup truck, and Nancy drove, and Mike and I held the two boys together, and we drove down I-75 toward the foundry in Sarasota. And the vibration from the truck took the arms started falling off, and the neck got wobbly. Well, it wasn't long before a sheriff's car pulled us over at about 6 a.m. And they said that we'd been phoned in for dismembering some young boys. He made us get off the highway and stay on 301 the rest of the way. At any rate, the small dome and the Tyrone School were both on the church's campus, with the school housing the Sunday religious services and the RE. As they were building the small dome, they still met in it, even unfinished. When it was finished, Reverend Young's office and the church office were in the north half, and they had a little kitchenette. And in the south half is where the congregation met. And they met there from 1974 through 88. Reverend Young presided over the construction of the new large dome sanctuary constructed in 87 and 88. Is that about right, Marla? I believe it's 87 or 86 through 88.
88, I'd say, over to 89.
Okay. By the way, speaking of Marla, she was on the building committee at that time, and she has some interesting stories she could relate, including this dome being set on these block walls and maybe not quite fitting. She'll share that with you sometime. Moving into this completed sanctuary was part of the last church service in the small dome. And the congregants picked up their chairs and carried them in here and set them down and finished the service here. Another aside, I joined maybe a month or two after they moved in here. So I never actually knew, the meeting there. In 1973, Reverend Young submitted his resignation. Pardon? 93, what did I say? Whoops. 93. He had accepted an invitation to the Hawaii UU Church in Honolulu as their full-time minister. The appointment had been a dream job of his, and he'd paid close attention to that church and applied when the position became available. Well, UUCT then entered a time of interim ministers, and we've had a good number since then. An interim minister's job is to transition the congregation from the ways of the old minister to the new ways that the new minister might show up. And believe it or not, there can be some friction. I don't want to change, the attitude when a new minister comes in. And so I'll mention just one, since it involves Diana and I. Interim Minister Reverend James McKinley was here from 95 through 97. He was a recent graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and by the way, he had been president of the Nature Conservancy for the state of Florida. So he was well versed in many areas. He ministered to our needs for those 2 years, and he did an exceptional job of preparing us for the new settled minister. And another aside, he also took a group of us whitewater rafting and kayaking in the Ocoee River, Chattooga River in South Carolina and North Georgia. That was a lot of fun. Gene will tell you about that, Gene and Joan. Some other incidentals. Reverend McKinley and Reverend Young are the only ministers that had young growing families that I'm aware of. There were some earlier ministers, in the 50s and 60s, but I haven't found information on that yet. Secondly, Reverend McKinley conducted the marriage ceremony for Diana and I in 95, and in 97 for Ed and Pat Benedict. We really liked the guy. Well, this is the end of the church history for the 20th century. We began sometime in 1952 or through 5, we don't know, depending upon how you wish to describe the beginning. To create another opportunity for me to speak, you'll have to ask me back to talk about 21st century history, if you dare. At any rate, thanks for your time and tolerance, and long may UUCT live and prosper. Thank you.